So we got a whole lot of Pitt going on today. This is a big Pitt day, a lot of big Pitt things happening, and there's a lot to talk about, a lot to get ready for. Spring camp starting this morning, Pitt's ACC Tournament experience. I don't know if I can't call it an ACC Tournament run because you would have to win a game before it can be a run. So we don't know if that's going to happen. There's probably a decent chance of it happening. Pitt certainly can beat Notre Dame. It's just a question of whether they will, and well, you just never can tell. Jeff Capel has never won more than one game in the ACC tournament at Pitt. He is, I believe, 4-6 over the last 6 seasons. So he's won one game. 2 of those 4 wins came in the last 2 seasons, but he's never won a second game in the ACC tournament. Maybe that opportunity will present itself after the Panthers, if they're able to beat Notre Dame and then take on North Carolina, maybe they'll get that second win. Certainly capable of beating Notre Dame, certainly capable of beating North Carolina, certainly capable of beating Wake Forest if they get that far. But, of course, it's got to start today against the Irish. But before that game even happens at 2 o'clock this afternoon, we've got spring football this morning. So there's a lot going on in the world of Pitt today. There's a lot going on right here on the Morning Pitt. There's a lot for us to talk about. Certainly a lot of coverage at Panther-Lair.com. So let's get into it. Let's talk about this game this afternoon. Let's talk about spring football, what we're going to be watching, what we're going to be looking for and looking forward to. Let's talk all things Pitt on a busy Pitt sports day here on the Tuesday edition of the Morning Pitt, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. I said this on the boards over the weekend, on the message boards, and I probably said it every year at this time of year. I know everybody loves March. Everybody loves March Madness. It is one of the best sporting events of the calendar. But I tell you, the conference tournament week is every bit as good, if not better than that those first 4 days of the NCAA tournament. I mean, when you think about the best sporting events on the calendar year, you go 12 months, you talk about, the first weekend or two of the NFL playoffs are pretty awesome because you get a lot of games and it's awesome and exciting. NHL playoffs are its own special beast, a different kind of intensity maybe than any other sport really has, and that's fun to watch. Obviously, March Madness, that first weekend of the NCAA tournament is pretty much undefeated. But conference tournament week, where you have just a barrage of games. I mean, just game after game after game, and every single one is an elimination game. Some of these teams that might lose, maybe they're still going to make it into the NCAA tournament, but in terms of their conference tournament, it's an elimination game. Win or go home. You either win and advance or you're done. And I don't think there is not another time on the sports calendar where you have this many elimination games all going on at once. Even just in the ACC. I mean, today there's 3 games, right? Pitt Notre Dame starts it off at 2 o'clock. Virginia Tech Cal at 4:30, and then Florida State Syracuse in the 7 o'clock game tonight. Then each of the next 2 days you have 4 games each. 4 games each. I mean, that's, if there's one upside to these bloated conferences, is that you get multiple days with 4 games. I mean, there are going to be 11 elimination games in the ACC alone just over the next 3 days, today, tomorrow, and Thursday. Leading up to the semifinals on Friday and then the championship on Saturday. I mean, it doesn't get much better than this. You love these days, particularly with the way the weather's looking right now. You open you sit down in the afternoon, you put on your TV, you open the windows, the wind is blowing, it's fresh air, and you're watching just nonstop college basketball all day long. I would contend that it's better than the NCAA tournament itself. This week, there will never be a point after 12 o'clock, pretty much any day throughout the week, where you won't be able to turn on an elimination game in a conference tournament. It's fantastic. I love it. And, from our perspective, it starts today at 2 o'clock when Pitt takes on Notre Dame. The Panthers lost to the Irish, of course, in South Bend earlier this season. One of those games that got away. I mean, I think you could probably put there's a short list of games where this season really, got away from Pitt. They should have won that first Louisville game. They lose in overtime to Clemson. Obviously the second Carolina game, the Wake Forest game, the Notre Dame game. I mean, there's 5, 6, you could maybe even throw in the second Louisville game, although not as much. But I mean, there's 5, 6 games you look at and you're just like, How did that one get away from you? How did you lose that game? You know, if you win that game, if you win 3 out of those 5 I just mentioned, or 4 out of those 6 that I just mentioned, or maybe even 3 out of those 6 that I just mentioned, we're having a totally different conversation right now. Totally different, and we could still have things to argue about and complain about, but it's a different kind of conversation because Pitt is pretty firmly in the NCAA tournament field, depending on which one of those games you win. But instead, they lost. So nothing is guaranteed. Obviously, everything's sort of up in the air until the games actually get played. But this game against Notre Dame, this is a winnable game for Pitt. Pitt can beat this Notre Dame team. Probably should beat this Notre Dame team. Even though we're 31 games into this season, we probably should be past the point of saying that Pitt probably should beat a team because we've seen them lose plenty of the games that they should win. But they're going into this game against Notre Dame on a high note. Coming off that win over Boston College where they got a 26-point win, one of the biggest that Pitt has ever lodged against an ACC opponent. And they're coming in having played one of their best games literally in months. I think when you look at the overall performance and what they did and how they did it, this team, there's a chance to pick up on how they played Saturday night and carry it into today. And some of that, some of it you can't control. You can't control when the ball goes in. You're going to have some unlucky bounces. You're going to have some lucky bounces. But you can control a few things. You can control what you do with the lineup. You can control whether you play one center or two centers at the same time. And certainly I, and most people watching this, I presume, would advocate for playing one center as they did on Saturday night. And whether the minutes end up favoring Guillermo Diaz-Graham or favoring Cam Corrin is less interesting to me or less relevant to me than how they're used. And whether you go in a straight rotation like they did on Saturday night. Now, obviously, we talked about that plus-minus yesterday where Cam Corrin played 17 minutes, and Pitt was +1 with Corrin on the court, even though he scored 16 points, and that Guillermo Diaz-Graham only scored 6 points or 8 points or whatever it was in 19 minutes, and Pitt was +30 with Guillermo on the court. So one could look at those numbers and say, maybe just give the edge to Guillermo again, which he had. He played more minutes on Saturday night than Cam Corrin did. So maybe you go that way. But it's just as much, if not more, to me about whether you use those guys together, which they did for the better part of 30 games, or you use them really in a rotation with each other, as they did on Saturday night. And it seemed to work pretty well. So I would advocate for that. I think that's a big, important place to start. You also need Jalen Lowe to play like he played on Saturday, which quite frankly is not really the way he played for most of this season, and certainly not over the last 2 months. He needs to be in that kind of mode, in distribution mode, getting to double-digit assists again after he had 10 against Boston College. He needs to play like that because that's got as much to do with Pitt's success as anything. And when he was not playing like that, it had as much to do with Pitt's lack of success as anything. You need Jalen Lowe to play that way and perform that way and set up his teammates that way and be more thoughtful in his shots and better in his decision-making that way. The way he was against Boston College. And I think if you get those things, if you get Jalen Lowe playing with that approach and you handle the center position correctly, I think Pitt will win this game this afternoon. I really do. Now, I know it's a question of whether they will do those things. I'm thinking that because they did it on Saturday night and because it worked as well as it did, they should be, thinking, hey, let's do that again. That worked. Let's do that again. But we'll find out. We'll see when the starting lineups get announced. That's going to go a long way in telling us what they intend to do. If they go back to Guillermo Diaz-Graham and Cam Corrin starting together, then, well, they'll get whatever is coming to them, and they will deserve it. If they go back to, or if Jalen Lowe goes back to the style of play that he had for the better part of the last 2 months, they'll also get what is coming to them, and they'll probably deserve it. But if they can tap into some of what they found on Saturday night, then they might just find themselves playing again tomorrow. which is fun because it'll mean we'll do another post-game show tomorrow. We're going to go live after the game today, so anywhere between 4 and 4:30 we'll get started. We'll talk for 45 minutes or an hour, something like that. We'll do a post-game show. It'll be right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. If you want to make sure you don't miss it, like this video and subscribe to the YouTube channel, to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com, and turn on your notifications. Then you'll get an alert sent to your phone every time we go live. That way you won't miss something like a live post-game show. I suspect that whatever happens this afternoon, win or lose, it's going to be pretty interesting to talk about. And we will do that right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com after the game ends. So tune in for that today. Before that game happens, though, we're going to have lots of coverage on Panther-Lair.com, not just previewing the game, but recapping spring camp, because Pitt starts spring football this morning. Actually, depending on when you watch this, they might have already had their practice. We'll get to watch a little bit of the beginning of practice, as is always the case. Then we'll have interviews afterward with Pat Narduzzi and select players and coaches, as Pitt often says, which means they get to choose. We don't. Obviously, I know who we would like to talk to. There's a few players that certainly will be of interest, and a few coaches as well. We'll take who they give us, because we don't really have an alternative. But there's definitely going to be interesting things to look for in this in this spring camp over these next 15 practices leading up to the spring game, which I think is on April 12th. And we'll talk about the spring game as it gets closer, things that you'll be looking for. But I think, it starts, and I think I talked about this last week or maybe the week before as we were getting closer to spring camp. It really starts with Eli Holstein in spring practice. It's, maybe the biggest storyline for the team. It's not the only big storyline, but one of the biggest storylines, if not the biggest storyline for the team this season, and certainly this spring, is how Eli Holstein plays in his second year at Pitt. His second year in Cade Bell's offense, his second year as a Pitt Panther. He'll be a redshirt sophomore. Last year was his redshirt freshman season, and sometimes he played like it. Sometimes he played like a guy who had never been on the football field in college before. And sometimes he played like an absolute stud. Certainly, the goal this season will be to minimize the first ones, the ones where he looked like he had never been on a football field before, and maximize the other ones, the ones where he looked like an absolute stud. And that process starts this spring. I expect Eli Holstein to come into spring healthy, will be a good first start, and ready to take leadership and ownership of this team. And I think he established some of that with his play throughout the season last year, but he needs to walk into spring camp as the guy who is leading this team, the guy who is the number one quarterback, the number one leader, the man for this team. That's the approach Eli Holstein needs to have. And, we won't really be able to see it, because that's a hard thing to observe from the sidelines, but that's very important for Pitt, if not, the most important thing. And we'll see what comes of that. But this needs to be, this will be a huge spring camp for Eli Holstein and this whole offense. And I know I talked about this, I think it was last week, where we talked about how much they need to be able to hit the ground running, that they can't come in and still be learning the offense and figuring this out and doing this and no, you've had a whole year in this offense. You've had more than 12 calendar months in this offense. You've had a whole spring camp, a whole training camp, a whole season, and then more off-season workouts. You need to come in as something far closer to a well-oiled machine than you probably were last year at this point, and then you were at various points over the course of last season. And, it's funny. We're going to talk a lot about Eli Holstein. We're going to talk a lot about where he stacks up, about, how he's looking and what he needs to do and all this different stuff. And, we're already going down that path. But I'm pretty intrigued by Julian Duggar, too. I don't know if I've talked enough about it since the bowl game, but, how great of a story would it have been if Julian Duggar had won that game? And I don't mean to say that he lost that game. If Pitt had won that game, how great of a story would Julian Duggar have been? True freshman coming in for his first playing time and ends up putting up a pretty big performance. Not perfect, of course, but good enough to win. And I think, that's a guy who, he should be the number 2 quarterback this year. He should be, and I think he will be, Eli Holstein's top backup. And I'm pretty intrigued by that. I'm pretty intrigued by how he'll function in that role and the kind of performance he'll have and how he'll play. And, if he's called upon, which there's probably a better than even chance that he's going to have to get on the field at some point, how he'll do, in his second year, as a redshirt freshman with a little bit of experience under his belt. So that's going to be intriguing too. It's going to be interesting to watch and see what the coaches say about Julian Duggar. This is like a major downside. I'm going to just sidebar for a second. A major downside of the current approach to Pitt's media policies and practices is that, there was the end of the season, right? The Boston College game on the road. Like a week later, you had signing day, right? And that was, happened locally. So you had the local media there, but nobody's asking questions about what happened over the final 5 games of the regular season, why they lost, this and that. There was the bowl game in Detroit against Toledo, and some local media was out there, but that's immediately after a gut-wrenching loss that, there were a lot of questions, a lot of things to talk about. And we haven't really talked to anybody from Pitt in any kind of formal media setting or press conference setting since then. Today's March 11th. When was the bowl game? Like December 28th or something like that? So 31 days for January, 28 days for February. That's 59 days plus, was the bowl game on the 28th? So that's 3 more. That's 62 days plus 11 days into March. Almost 75 days since that bowl game and we haven't talked to these people at all. I want to ask about Julian Duggar. Hell, I want to ask about kicking a field goal in the double overtime, in the second overtime. There's lots of questions that it would be great to ask about. But unfortunately, today we're going to get into the spring practice setting. And Pat Narduzzi is going to talk to us after practice, and the players and coaches will talk to us after practice, and they'll just want to talk about practice, even if we ask about other things. And so it's a little bit disappointing because I think there's a lot to talk about. Am I going to walk into the first practice of spring camp and ask about Julian Duggar? I mean, at some point we probably will, but it feels like there's other questions to ask. There's a lot of questions to ask. And so it'd be nice if we just could get a chance to talk to these guys sometime in January or February. But alas, who needs publicity? But I digress. Obviously, the offensive line is a big storyline this spring, and we've been hammering that all offseason. We're going to continue hammering that all offseason. We'll see what impact the 3 transfers have. Ditto for defensive end, what impact the 3 transfers have there. You look at the positions that they really address the most with transfers. It's offensive line, it's defensive end, and it's wide receiver. I think, did they bring in 4 wide receivers or 3? I'm losing count. Deuce Span, Andy Jean, Blue Hicks. Maybe it was just 3, unless I'm forgetting someone. But those are the positions that they really hit the hardest with transfers, and understandably so, certainly on the offensive line and defensive end, and I can understand why they might want to reload at wide receiver a little bit with some transfers. But those 3 spots, a lot of transfers, certainly, I think the offensive line and defensive end is going to be, those are 2 position groups that they need a massive upgrade from what they got last year. And they're trying to get it out of the transfer portal in addition to hoping some of the young players develop and improve throughout the season. But those are going to be probably some of the key areas we're going to be focused on the most, is how the offensive line is coming along and what they can do to get more pressure out of the defensive ends, get more of an impact out of the pass rushers, because they really didn't have much last year. And I like Jimmy Scott coming back. Again, you're going to have a bunch of transfers coming in, and all those guys are here now. So, I mean, that's huge. You get that extra spring camp work with those guys, but it's just got to take some steps. In order for this team to take steps forward from where they were a year ago, those position groups, in particular, the offensive line and the defensive ends, are going to have to take steps forward. On top of, Eli Holstein playing better and all those different things that we talk about. And then you have the returning stars. You have the Kyle Lewis and the Rasheem Biles, even like, and the Desmond Reed, even like a Kenny Johnson, Javon McIntyre coming back. You have guys who have started, you have guys who have played a lot, you have guys who have made a big impact, and they're going to be coming back looking to build on the success they've already had. So no shortage of storylines in spring camp this year for Pitt. And we'll be covering all of them and finding new ones over the course of the next 5 weeks, all right there at Panther-Lair.com. Don't forget the website, Panther-Lair.com. We're on the 24/7 Sports Network. We'd love to have you join us. I think we've still got the promo running. I don't know, because that thing, is probably ending pretty soon. I don't know how long you can give away subscriptions for 75% off. I might have to reach out to the 24/7 sports guys and be like, guys, let's stop giving this away. It's time for people to pay full price. So if you want to get on the site, now is the time to do it. Go to Panther-Lair.com, the Pitt site on the 24/7 Sports Network. All right, Pitt football this morning, Pitt basketball this afternoon, postgame show after the basketball game, all right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So thanks for tuning in today. I hope you had a great Monday. I hope you enjoy your Tuesday. There's a lot of Pitt stuff happening. We'll talk to you later this afternoon for the live postgame show, and then we'll catch up with you tomorrow for the Morning Pitt right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.